The Original Sin, the Idea That Colored Humanity. Introduction, the Genesis of an Idea. So, the serpent didn't really have a problem with Adam and Eve walking around butt naked in the Garden of Eden. No, no, no. The problem was that Adam and Eve felt no shame for the way they looked. So the serpent decided to spill the beans on God's little secret that would eventually lead to the original sin. An idea that in its simplest form says, I am, or you are, not good enough, and I, or you, need to change to become better. It's an idea so simple yet so powerful. It was to forever shape how humans would feel about themselves and each other. It's an idea that also helps to explain many of today's events, ranging from George Floyd's murder to the Capitol Hill riots, from the poverty across the post colonial world to the royal obsession with the color of Megan's baby. This book explores the genesis of this idea and how, over time, it has come to shape our worldview today. An idea hidden in such plain sight, it has kept so many people blindly judging the behavior of self and others, instead of seeing beyond sight to discover who we really are. But before we get there, let's return to our garden, shall we? And so the serpent slowly slithered unto Eve and whispered softly in her ear, God forbids you to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Out of fear your eyes shall be opened, and ye too shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Eve, being the liberal woman she was, cast aside God's authority and doctrine, took a high-calorie bite of the forbidden fruit, and shared the spoils with Adam. Angry at himself, God is of course male, for having botched up his own intelligent design, God designed some in vogue garments for Adam and Eve to hide their now glaringly obvious shame, banished them from the garden, and threw away the key. The nude garden would no longer be open for business, lest these liberal humanists also eat fruit from the tree of life and thus live forever. To add insult to injury, God then cursed the whole lot of them, and just to make his point, cursed their descendants too. All serpents were to eat dust. All men were destined to paid labor. All women were to be ruled by men. Caesarean sections were forbidden, so all women would suffer painful and less paid labor. And all humans were destined to return to dust. The same dust probably serpents eat, no doubt. And so from the book of Genesis, an idea was soon born, the original sin. All humans inherit a nature of disobedience to divine authority, and so are inclined to do evil. By educating people to A. Feel shame for their own sinful, inferior nature, and B. Feel fear of external exclusion in the hereafter. If they didn't change, enthusiasts urged people to dedicate their lives to changing themselves for the better. So, how does one change, you may ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. The answer is by climbing the ladder of goodness that starts from one's own inferior self and rises towards the image of a superior other, a god. What happens then? Well, we live forever, of course. A bit of a workaround, by the way, since the tree of life itself was already off limits. Although the biblical book of Genesis is no more than 38,262 words long, which is a couple of high school term papers, the ensuing idea of the original sin and the need for humans to grow, to become better, and to live up to the image of someone else has strongly influenced how humans have looked at themselves and others until today. Throughout the ages, the image of superiority would be colored in various ways to fit the needs of authority. Images have ranged from pious saints to knights in shining armor, to movie actors, to people with a particular skin color. Those images then shaped the steps of the ladder that people needed to climb to get there. Take, for example, the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church used the original sin to gently nudge people to be meek and wait for authority to attain salvation. It kept generations in servitude and ignorance. In 1449, the Spanish introduced the purity of blood laws to differentiate Christians who were higher on the ladder of purity. They were good. From Muslims and Jews who were at the bottom. They were not good. Some Jews converted to Christianity just to get by, but they would never really be pure. Those same laws were modified by the Spaniards some decades later in the Americas. They started to use skin color to differentiate impure brown Native Americans from pure white Europeans. Initially, 16 different castes were assigned to divide humans based on their skin color. Later, when the natives died of the viruses brought by the Europeans, Africans were simply brought to the Americas to fill in the job vacancies nobody wanted. The ladder of goodness was extended from 16 shades of color to more than 40. White is pure and all things good. Black is simply, well, not good. Meanwhile, back in the 16th century Europe, some folks started to protest against the Catholic way of looking at the world. They were called Protestants. Protest, get it? Some of them taught that only those predestined would be saved from the curse of the original sin. Because it's rather difficult to simply look at someone to know if they are predestined, the idea emerged that predestination could be observed from how people lived. Hard work and stinginess were to be the two characteristics of good, and so the climb out of original sin would now be through hard work. What came to be known as the Protestant work ethic was born in Northern Europe and differed from the Catholic work ethic in which people just waited on others just to get salvation. Some argue this new work ethic kicked off capitalism in the 17th century and gave a further push to colonialism. By the end of the 18th century, it was the same capitalism that drove James Cook's expedition down under, which is Australia. It was James Cook who discovered Aboriginals, who in turn fought the intruders. The Aboriginals didn't behave good, so their children were stolen from them to be educated in boarding schools about why they were not good and how to behave better so they could live forever. That same fate also befell the also not good Native American children across North America. For Africans, the original sin also sucked big time. By the 18th century, dark skin color was proof of descendancy from Ham, the fallen son of Noah in the book of Genesis, whose descendants were cursed by Moses to be servants of servants. Well, that of course was on top of God's original curse, of course. If Moses cursed Africans to be slaves, who are we to say otherwise? So Africans? Not good. When capitalism gave a further nudge to the scramble for Africa by the Europeans in the late 19th century, African kingdoms started to raid each other to supply a constant flow of slaves. The ensuing brutality of the African wars was proof that Africans were not the descendants of Ham after all, but rather a subhuman species, like the Native Americans. They were pre-Adamite, and that of course was not good. Meanwhile, in the mid-19th century, the capitalism brought forth by the Protestant work ethic now brought opium to China. The Chinese would soon be labeled as sick men and the yellow peril. Not good. That justified, of course, the opium wars that followed, and that ended with the Chinese handing over Hong Kong to Britain. The quest for goodness today has much of the post-colonial world either whitening their skin, straightening their hair, or buying colored lenses just to climb out of the shame they were indoctrinated with so they could look and feel, well, good. Yet, color was not the only standard we came to use to measure the goodness of self and others. It is just the tip of the iceberg. Gender: men top, women bottom. What about sexual orientation? Straight versus bent. Religion: good versus evil. And physical appearance: fat versus skinny. All ideas to measure people against some better standard. All ideas that can be traced back to just one idea: the original sin and the need of humanity to climb out of their inferiority towards goodness, purity, and salvation. Okay, so now you're probably a bit shocked by this different perspective on the origins of human identity. You're not alone. Throughout my years of running diversity workshops around the world, I continue to encounter emotions of shock, disbelief, and even anger. Yet, if we take time to dig into human behavior, today's events can really be explained without having to revert to labels such as race, curse, genetics, or whatever truths we were taught in school to explain others. These events can be more easily explained by the ideas we use to explain ourselves and others. But how were we to know anyway? Our education was never intended to question why we do, nor who we are, nor investigate the hidden ideas of history that have come to define our identity. The education we know today we inherit from Protestant efforts in the 19th century to teach children obedience and biblical ideas that were conveyed as truth. In this book, I argue that the original sin is not when humans became disobedient and woke up to the knowledge of good and evil. These were ideas the Persian prophet Zoroaster came up with 3,000 years ago. Quite the contrary, the original sin was when humans fell asleep, believing in the idea of their own inferiority, leading to the shame that has blinded so many from the truth of who they really are. This book is intended to give you an alternative perspective of yourself and others, to look differently at what you think you need to be based on others' ideas about who you are. By investigating and unraveling these ideas, I hope you can regain your insight, wisdom, and strength so you can stop looking up because you were never down. So, what on earth drove me to write this book in the first place? Well, that's a long story. The short version consists of 5 words: racism, career, depression, meditation, and freedom. Here's the long version. So, I grew up in Australia in the 80s. Despite Australia being shaped by immigrants from all over the world, if you didn't fit the Anglo-Saxon mold, there was hell to pay. Despite my green eyes and light skin, pay I did. Go back to where you came from was one of the many daily harassments. Slowly I turned inward and felt a deep level of insecurity about who I was. That was the racism bit. To create a new I wanted to become smart. So I focused on excelling in academics, all the way from primary school to getting an MBA from an Ivy League school. That was my climb from inferiority to superiority. But oh crap, that didn't work to take away the insecurity either. What about finding refuge in some secure attachment figure like a god or some philosophy? So I went from Christianity to Islam to Freemasonry to Rosicrucianism to Knights Templars to Judaism and even Buddhism. It was like I was searching for an answer to a question I was never able to put under words. By the way, that gives me a flashback to the movie The Matrix. It's the question that drives us, Neo. Anyway, so did the answer lie in a successful professional career? I went from consultant to national economic policy advisor to regional managing director of an international bank. Still nothing. Well, so far for career. In 2016, I did find a third word though, the one called depression. Out of total depression, I attended a 10-day Vipassana meditation course. Vipassana is an ancient Pali word meaning to see in a special way, to see reality as it is and not as it appears to us. And that was number 4, meditation. Soon after the course, some weird ass stuff started to happen. I began to observe my thoughts and emotions instead of identifying with them, and started to view human behavior from a very different perspective instead of merely judging it. The question I had been trying to answer all these years started to materialize. Who am I? Now that was freedom. It has become my passion to share with you the answers about what I found in the original sin. To start our journey together, part 1 revisits your mind and how it has evolved, how ideas became so resilient, highly contagious, almost impossible to eradicate. I will show that we have needed ideas to make meaning of reality, for without ideas of what is and what isn't, our ancestors would not have been able to predict, and you wouldn't have been around to read this book. Part 1 then takes you on a historic journey of how the idea of the original sin was exported to the far corners of the earth, and how we have now come to view others. Part 2 helps us to understand how yesterday's ideas shape our behaviors and events today. It goes to show we don't really have some fixed personality grounded in genetics, ethnicity, or culture. Rather, our behavior is an emotional reaction based on our idea of who the other person is. After all, I don't know who I am unless I know who you are. It helps us understand better that people don't do because of who they are, but because of who they think they are. Part 2 goes on to look at some experiments I love carrying out with groups of people to show them that anyone can behave like a dictator or a slave within 40 minutes. The last chapter looks at how ideas have come to influence entire economies across the globe, giving a new explanation to the wealth and poverty of nations. And then we round off with part 3. This part takes a bold new look at you, away from all the ideas you may have learned about yourself from your parents, school, and the media, an awakening to a new perspective of you may never have dreamed possible. I'll take you on a fascinating journey into space, time, and reality, and how that helps us to rethink everything, who we are, and how we relate to others and our world. I hope that on our journey together, you will come to see the same things I've come to realize, that you are a reality beyond ideas and have a potential beyond words.